My name is Natalie Brooks, and Christmas Eve 2024 was the night my family made me eat my dinner outside in the cold like a stray dog while they celebrated inside with warmth and laughter. What they didn't know was that the phone call I'd receive 3 days later would change everything, and the man on the other end would hold the key to something they'd been hiding from me for years. Sometimes the people who treat you worst are the ones who need you most, and sometimes walking away is the only way to discover your true worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frost on the windows looked like delicate lace patterns, but inside the warmth of my childhood home on Maple Ridge Drive, there was nothing delicate about the conversation happening without me. I could hear Victoria's voice through the glass, sharp and commanding as always, directing the placement of the good china and crystal glasses that only came out for special occasions. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls drifted through the gaps around the front door, a cruel reminder of everything I was being excluded from. Cedar Falls, Oregon had always been the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where Christmas meant something, where families gathered around dinner tables, laden with traditions passed down through generations. Our house sat at the end of Maple Ridge Drive, a sprawling colonial with white columns and a wraparound porch that had been photographed for the town's tourism brochure 3 years running. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. From where I sat on the cold concrete steps, clutching a paper plate with a small portion of turkey and a scoop of mashed potatoes, that perfection felt like a lie wrapped in holiday lights. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same porch where I'd learned to ride my first bicycle, where Robert Brooks, my father, had taught me to tie my shoes, where Linda, my mother, had braided my hair before school picture days. Now it served as my dining room because apparently I wasn't worthy of eating with the rest of the family. The wooden planks beneath me were slick with winter moisture, and my breath came out in small puffs of white fog that disappeared into the December night. Through the dining room window, I could see them all seated around the mahogany table that had belonged to my grandmother. Victoria sat at the head, naturally, her auburn hair perfectly styled in loose waves that caught the chandelier light. She wore a deep emerald dress that complemented her eyes, and when she laughed at something Kevin said, her whole face lit up with genuine joy. My brother Kevin, 2 years younger than me but somehow always treated as the golden child, was regaling the table with stories from his new job at the law firm in Portland. His girlfriend Sarah had driven down from the city just for dinner, and she fit seamlessly into our family dynamic in a way I never seemed to manage. My parents flanked the table like bookends, Robert in his navy sweater that Linda had given him last Christmas, and Linda herself wearing the pearl necklace that had been her mother's. They were all there, all together, all belonging in a way that felt as natural as breathing. And I was outside, banned from my own family's Christmas dinner for the crime of existing differently than they wanted me to. The argument had started 3 hours earlier when I'd arrived with a casserole dish of sweet potato soufflé, my contribution to the meal that I'd spent all morning preparing. I'd walked through the front door expecting the usual controlled chaos of holiday preparation, the gentle bickering over oven space and last-minute recipe adjustment. Instead, I'd found Victoria standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, her expression cold enough to freeze the cranberry sauce. She'd looked me up and down with the kind of assessment that made my skin crawl, taking in my simple black dress and cardigan, my modest jewelry, my hair that I'd spent an hour curling but which didn't quite achieve the effortless elegance that seemed to come naturally to her. When her gaze finally met mine, there was something predatory in her smile, like a cat that had cornered a mouse and was deciding how long to play before delivering the killing blow. The first criticism had been about my contribution to the meal. Victoria had lifted the foil from my casserole dish and wrinkled her nose as if I'd brought something rotting. She'd announced to the kitchen that she'd already prepared sweet potatoes. Thank you very much, and that mine looked a bit amateur compared to her grandmother's recipe that she'd been perfecting for years. Linda had glanced between us nervously, her hands fluttering around the edges of her apron, but she'd said nothing. Robert had been carving the turkey with mechanical precision, his jaw tight in the way it got when he wanted to avoid confrontation. The second criticism had been about my appearance. Victoria had suggested, with false sweetness dripping from every word, that perhaps I might want to freshen up before the guests arrived. She'd mentioned that Diane Walsh, Mother's book club friend, would be joining us, along with Tom Rivera, the neighbor who'd been widowed last spring, and whom Victoria had been quietly trying to set up with me for months. She'd made it clear that my current state of dress might not make the best impression, might not reflect well on the family's standards, but it was the third criticism that had cut deepest, the one that had led to this moment of exile on the front porch. Victoria had waited until I was in the dining room, adjusting the placement of the cloth napkins on the formal table, before she'd delivered her masterstroke. She'd walked up behind me and spoken in a voice just loud enough for everyone in the adjacent rooms to hear. A voice that carried the weight of years of resentment, wrapped in the guise of sisterly concern. She'd told me that she'd been thinking about our family traditions, about the importance of maintaining certain standards during the holidays, about how Christmas dinner was a time for celebrating success and achievement, and forward momentum in life. She'd mentioned, as if it were a casual observation, that some people seemed to be stuck in patterns that weren't serving them well, that perhaps this year it might be better if those people took some time to reflect on their choices rather than bringing their energy to the family table. The words had hit me like a physical blow, but it was the silence that followed that truly devastated me. Kevin had looked up from his phone, his expression uncomfortable but not surprised, as if this conversation had been planned without my knowledge. Linda had continued arranging flowers in the centerpiece vase, her movements becoming more frantic and purposeless. Robert had cleared his throat and mumbled something about checking the wine in the cellar, and I had stood there surrounded by my family, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my entire life. When I'd asked for clarification, when I'd forced Victoria to say explicitly what she was implying, she'd sighed as if I were being deliberately obtuse. She'd explained that my recent life choices, my continued struggles to find my footing professionally, my apparent inability to maintain a serious relationship, my general failure to launch into proper adulthood at the age of 20, made me a less than ideal dinner companion for what was supposed to be a celebration of family achievement. She gestured toward Kevin and his girlfriend, toward her own recent promotion at the marketing firm, toward our parents' upcoming cruise to celebrate their 35th wedding anniversary. She'd painted a picture of a family moving forward together while I remained stagnant, a weight dragging them down, a reminder of disappointment when they were trying to focus on success. The suggestion that I take my plate outside had been presented as a kindness, a way for me to have some quiet time to think about what I wanted to contribute to the family dynamic going forward. She'd even offered to bring me a blanket, as if that would somehow make the humiliation more comfortable. The alternative, she'd made clear without saying it directly, was that I could leave entirely and spend Christmas alone in my small apartment across town. So here I sat, on the porch of my childhood home, eating lukewarm turkey while my family celebrated inside without me. The temperature had dropped since sunset, and my fingers were starting to go numb despite the thin gloves I'd put on. I could hear the murmur of conversation, and occasional bursts of laughter from inside, the clink of silverware against china, the warm sounds of family togetherness that I was no longer welcome to share. A car pulled into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the lawn and illuminating the carefully maintained landscaping that Victoria had hired professionals to install last spring. Diane Walsh emerged from a silver sedan, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing a coat that probably cost more than my rent. She paused when she saw me sitting on the porch, her expression shifting from surprise to embarrassment to careful neutrality. She approached slowly, her heels clicking on the flagstone walkway that led to the front steps. When she reached the bottom of the porch, she stopped and looked up at me with the kind of smile that people use when they encounter something awkward but want to pretend everything is normal. Her voice was carefully modulated when she spoke, as if she were addressing a child who'd been put in timeout. She asked if I was getting some fresh air, if I was feeling well, if perhaps I'd needed a moment away from the festivities inside. Her tone suggested that she was offering me an opportunity to provide a face-saving explanation for why I was sitting alone on the porch during Christmas dinner. I could have told her I was feeling sick, could have said I'd stepped outside to take a phone call, could have invented any number of reasonable explanations that would have preserved everyone's dignity. Instead, I told her the truth. I explained that Victoria had decided I wasn't suitable company for Christmas dinner, that my family had collectively agreed I should eat outside while they enjoyed their meal in the warmth and comfort of the dining room. I watched Diane's face cycle through several emotions: confusion, discomfort, disbelief, before settling on a kind of horrified politeness that made it clear she had no idea how to respond to such an unprecedented social situation. She stood there for a long moment, wine bottle clutched in her manicured hands, clearly weighing whether to knock on the front door and pretend this conversation had never happened, or to acknowledge the complete absurdity of what I'd just told her. Finally, she climbed the steps and sat down beside me on the cold concrete, her expensive coat spread carefully beneath her to protect it from the moisture. We sat in silence for several minutes, two women on a porch at Christmas, one eating dinner from a paper plate, and the other holding a bottle of wine like a shield. Eventually Diane spoke, her voice quiet and thoughtful. She told me that she'd known my family for 15 years, had watched Victoria and Kevin and me grow up through holiday gatherings and summer barbecues and graduation parties. She said she'd always admired how close our family seemed, how supportive and loving we appeared to be. Then she said something that hit me like a revelation wrapped in sadness. She told me that in all those years of observing our family dynamics, she'd noticed that I was often the one taking care of everyone else's needs, making sure everyone else was comfortable, smoothing over conflicts and managing expectations. She said she'd watched me shrink myself smaller and smaller over the years, accommodating everyone else's preferences and priorities until I'd nearly disappeared entirely. She asked me when I'd last done something purely for myself, when I'd last made a decision based solely on what I wanted rather than what would keep the peace or make everyone else happy. The question hung in the cold air between us like a challenge, and I realized I couldn't remember the answer. I couldn't recall the last time I'd prioritized my own needs, my own desires, my own sense of what was right and wrong. Diane stood up after a few more minutes, brushing off her coat and adjusting her purse strap. She told me she was going to make an excuse about feeling unwell and drive home rather than participate in a dinner that excluded one of the family members. She said she hoped I would find the courage to stop accepting treatment that diminished my worth, and she walked back to her car without knocking on the front door. I watched her taillights disappear down Maple Ridge Drive, and for the first time all evening, I felt a spark of something that might have been clarity. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape I'd been too close to see clearly. This wasn't just about Christmas dinner. This wasn't even just about Victoria's latest attempt to establish her dominance in the family hierarchy. This was about a pattern that had been building for years, a systematic erosion of my place in my own family that I'd been too loyal, too hopeful, too afraid to fully acknowledge. The front door opened behind me, spilling warm light and the sound of conversation onto the porch. I turned, expecting to see Linda with an offer of dessert or perhaps Kevin coming to check on me with awkward brotherly concern. Instead, Victoria stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her with deliberate care. She was still wearing her emerald dress, but she'd added a cream-colored shawl that made her look like she was posing for a holiday magazine. Her expression was perfectly composed, not quite sympathetic but not entirely cold either. She had mastered the art of appearing reasonable while delivering devastating blows, and I could see her preparing to deploy that skill now. She told me that Diane had sent her regrets and gone home, mentioning something about feeling unwell. Victoria's tone suggested that she knew exactly why Diane had left but wasn't going to acknowledge it directly. She said that everyone inside was having a lovely time, that the dinner had been a complete success, that the conversation had been stimulating and joyful in exactly the way she'd hoped it would be. Then she sat down beside me on the porch steps, careful to maintain enough distance that we weren't quite touching. Her voice took on the patient tone she used when she wanted to sound wise and caring, the tone that always preceded her most cutting observation. She told me that she could see I was upset, that she understood this situation was difficult for me, but that sometimes difficult situations were necessary for growth. She explained that she'd been concerned about me for a long time, watching me drift through my 20s without the kind of clear direction and purpose that characterized successful adults. She mentioned my series of part-time jobs, my inability to maintain long-term relationships, my apparent lack of ambition or drive to create the kind of life that would make the family proud. She said she'd hoped that being excluded from tonight's dinner might serve as a wake-up call, a motivation for me to make some real changes in my life. Victoria told me that she loved me, that we all loved me, but that love sometimes required tough choices. She said that enabling my current patterns wasn't helping anyone, that maybe what I needed was some space to figure out who I wanted to be, and how I wanted to contribute to the family dynamic going forward. She made it sound like my exile was an act of compassion, a gift designed to help me grow into my potential. The manipulation was so smooth, so perfectly calibrated, that for a moment I almost believed her. For a moment I almost accepted that this humiliation was somehow for my own good, that my family's rejection was actually a form of love in disguise. Victoria had always been skilled at reframing her cruelty as concern, her control as guidance, her need to diminish others as a desire to help them improve. But sitting there on the cold porch steps, with the taste of lukewarm turkey still in my mouth, and the sound of my family's laughter echoing from inside the house, something inside me finally broke free. Not broke down, but broke free. The spell that had kept me apologizing for my existence, minimizing my needs, accepting whatever scraps of affection my family was willing to offer, finally shattered. I stood up slowly, brushing off my dress and gathering my purse from beside the porch railing. Victoria looked up at me with surprise, clearly expecting me to thank her for her wisdom or ask what I needed to do to earn my way back into the family's good graces. Instead, I told her something I'd never said before, something that felt both terrifying and liberating to speak aloud. I told her that I was done accepting treatment that no stranger would tolerate, done apologizing for existing, done shrinking myself to make room for everyone else's comfort. I said that if my family couldn't find space for me at their table, then perhaps it was time for me to find a different table entirely. Victoria's expression shifted from surprise to alarm, as she realized I wasn't following the script she'd written for this conversation. She started to speak, probably to explain why I was overreacting, or to offer some conditional path back to acceptance, but I was already walking toward my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys, not from cold but from the adrenaline of finally choosing myself over their approval. As I drove away from Maple Ridge Drive, I could see the warm glow of the dining room windows in my rearview mirror, the silhouettes of my family continuing their celebration, as if nothing had changed. And maybe for them, nothing had. But for me, everything was different. I was driving toward an uncertain future, away from the only family I'd ever known, toward a life where I would have to figure out who I was, when I wasn't constantly trying to earn my place at someone else's table. The roads through Cedar Falls were nearly empty on Christmas Eve. Most families gathered safely in their homes around their own holiday tradition. I drove slowly through the downtown area, past the community center where the town Christmas tree stood, decorated with lights donated by local businesses, past Pine Valley Diner where the neon sign promised comfort food and friendly service to anyone who needed it. The contrast between the warm welcomes these public spaces offered and the conditional acceptance I'd just left behind wasn't lost on me. I ended up at Riverside Park, pulling into the empty parking lot and turning off the engine. The Cascade River ran through the center of town, and even in winter it moved with a steady murmur that I'd always found soothing. I sat in my car for a long time, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over me like snow accumulating on the windshield. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in my adult life, I had chosen my own dignity over my family's approval. I had walked away from a situation that was damaging my self-worth rather than enduring it in hopes that things would somehow improve. The decision felt both monumental and surprisingly simple, like finally acknowledging a truth I'd been avoiding for far too long. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, my heart jumped with hope that someone from my family was reaching out, that perhaps my absence had been noticed and regretted. Instead, it was a notification from my apartment complex's management company, Pacific Northwest Property Solutions. An automated message wishing all tenants happy holidays and reminding everyone that the office would be closed until December 27th. I stared at the message for a moment, struck by the irony that a property management company was offering me more warmth and consideration than my own family had. At least they acknowledged my existence, even if it was just through an automated holiday greeting. At least they treated me with basic courtesy and respect, even though our relationship was purely transactional. The thought led me to consider my small apartment across town, the one-bedroom space that Victoria had always described as temporary, a stepping stone to something more substantial and adult. But as I sat there in the parking lot, I realized that my apartment was the only place where I was unconditionally welcome, where I didn't have to earn my right to exist or justify my presence. It might be small and modest, but it was mine in a way that my childhood home had never truly been. I drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, past houses glowing with Christmas lights and families visible through windows, gathered around their own holiday tables. Instead of feeling excluded from their warmth, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. I was driving toward my own space, my own life, my own choices. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was moving towards something rather than away from something. My apartment building, Punwood Apartments, sat on a tree-lined street about 10 minutes from downtown Cedar Falls. It was an older building, converted from a grand Victorian mansion sometime in the 1980s, with high ceilings and original hardwood floors that creaked in a friendly way when you walked across them. The building housed 12 units, mostly young professionals and retirees who appreciated the character and charm of the historic architecture. As I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, I could hear faint sounds of holiday celebrations from some of the other units. Miss Thompson in 2A always hosted her grandchildren for Christmas Eve, and the sound of children's laughter drifted through her door. The couple in 2C had their television turned to a Christmas movie, the familiar dialogue of It's a Wonderful Life, providing a nostalgic soundtrack to my journey down the hallway. I unlocked my door and stepped into my own space, immediately struck by how different it felt from the grand but cold atmosphere I'd just left. My apartment was small but warm, decorated with thrift store finds and handmade touches that reflected my actual personality rather than some idealized version of who I was supposed to be. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable. The walls were covered with books and plants and artwork that made me smile, and everything in the space was there because I'd chosen it, not because it met someone else's standards of appropriateness. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite armchair, a deep blue recliner that Victoria had once described as aggressively unfashionable but which had been my refuge through countless difficult days. As I sat there in my own space, surrounded by my own choices, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt at home, not just physically but emotionally. I felt like I belonged exactly where I was, not because someone had granted me permission to be there, but because I had created a space that welcomed all of who I was. The evening passed quietly, peacefully, in a way that Christmas Eve had never felt in my family home. I didn't have to monitor anyone else's mood, didn't have to manage conflicts or smooth over tensions, didn't have to perform gratitude for treatment that diminished my worth. I could simply exist as myself, without apology or explanation or the constant fear that I might somehow lose my place at the table. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that walking away from my family's Christmas dinner hadn't been an ending, it had been a beginning. The beginning of a life where I chose my own worth instead of waiting for others to assign it to me, the beginning of relationships based on mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance, the beginning of understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop accepting treatment that teaches you to believe you deserve less than basic human dignity. Little did I know that in 3 days, my phone would ring with a call that would change everything, a conversation that would reveal just how much my family had been hiding from me, and how much power I actually held in a situation where I'd always felt powerless. But that night, Christmas Eve 2024, I fell asleep in my own bed, in my own space, surrounded by my own choices, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The morning after Christmas dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that seemed to match my internal landscape perfectly. I woke up in my own bed, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years after a family gathering, rest. No anxiety about whether I'd said the wrong thing, no replaying conversations to analyze every micro-expression for signs of disapproval, no wondering what I should have done differently to earn my place at the table. Just the quiet satisfaction of having finally chosen myself.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My phone had been silent all night, which told me everything I needed to know about my family's reaction to my departure.
Not a single text asking if I'd made it home safely. No voicemail wondering if I was okay. No message suggesting we should talk about what had happened. Their silence was louder than any argument could have been. A clear indication that my absence had been noticed, but not mourned. I made coffee in my small kitchen, standing at the window that overlooked the courtyard of Pinwood Apartments. The building's original gardens had been restored when it was converted, and even in winter there was something peaceful about the bare branches of the old oak trees and the carefully maintained pathways that wound between the units. Miss Thompson from 2A was already outside, bundled in a thick coat and walking her ancient corgi, Buster, who moved with the deliberate dignity of a dog who'd seen many seasons come and go. The normalcy of it struck me as profound. Here was a woman going about her daily routine, caring for her pet, living her life without drama or conditions or the need to earn her right to exist. She waved when she saw me at the window, a simple gesture of neighborly acknowledgement that carried more warmth than I'd felt from my own family in months. As I sipped my coffee, I found myself thinking about the patterns that had led to Christmas Eve's humiliation. It hadn't started with Victoria's decision to exile me from dinner. That had been just the latest, most visible manifestation of a dynamic that had been building for years, so gradually that I'd almost stopped noticing how much smaller I'd become. The erosion had begun sometime after college, when Victoria had landed her first real job at Patterson & Associates, a boutique marketing firm in Portland that specialized in luxury brand management. She'd started making more money than the rest of us, buying expensive clothes and driving a sleek BMW, and somehow her financial success had translated into an assumption of authority over family decisions. What had once been sibling rivalry had morphed into something more insidious. A systematic campaign to establish herself as the family's undisputed leader, while positioning me as the perpetual disappointment. It had started with small things, suggestions that felt like concern but carried the undertone of criticism. Victoria would comment on my clothing choices when we went out together, always framed as helpful advice about how I could present myself more professionally. She'd offer to take me shopping, then guide me towards styles that were more conservative, more muted, more forgettable than what I'd originally chosen. When I'd express enthusiasm about a new job or project, she'd respond with questions that highlighted potential problems rather than celebrating the opportunity. The pattern had become more pronounced over the past 2 years, as Victoria's career had continued to flourish while mine had remained frustratingly stagnant. I'd been working a series of contract positions, freelance projects that paid the bills but didn't offer the kind of stability or prestige that our family valued. Each family gathering had become an opportunity for Victoria to showcase her latest achievements, while highlighting my continued struggles to find my footing. She'd developed a talent for asking questions that sounded supportive but were designed to expose my vulnerability. She'd inquire about my love life with false sympathy, wondering aloud whether my standards might be too high or if perhaps I was giving off signals that discouraged potential partners. She'd ask about my career plans with exaggerated interest, then offer advice that subtly undermined my confidence in my chosen path. The most damaging aspect of Victoria's campaign hadn't been her direct attacks, which I could have recognized and defended against. It had been her skill at enlisting our parents and Kevin as unwitting accomplices in my diminishment. She'd learned to frame her criticisms as concern for my well-being, to present her attempts to control my choices as evidence of her caring, to position herself as the responsible daughter trying to help her struggling sister. Our parents, who'd always been conflict-averse and eager to maintain family harmony, had begun to defer to Victoria's judgment about what was best for me. When I'd express frustration about being treated like a child, they'd remind me that Victoria only wanted what was best for me, that she'd achieved the kind of success they hoped I could emulate. When I'd push back against Victoria's increasingly invasive suggestions, they'd frame my resistance as evidence that I wasn't taking responsibility for my own growth. Kevin, meanwhile, had been content to stay out of the fray as long as he wasn't the target of scrutiny. His own life had been proceeding smoothly enough that he could afford to remain neutral, neither defending me nor actively participating in my marginalization. His silence had become a form of complicity, a tacit agreement that Victoria's treatment of me was acceptable as long as it didn't affect him. The most insidious part of the whole dynamic had been how it had made me complicit in my own diminishment. I'd begun to internalize Victoria's assessments of my shortcomings, to question my own judgment about what I wanted and needed, to seek her approval even as I resented her control. I'd started making decisions based on what would minimize conflict rather than what would make me happy, accommodating her preferences even when they contradicted my own instinct. The Christmas Eve dinner had been the culmination of this pattern, the moment when Victoria's need for control had finally overridden any pretense of sisterly concern. By excluding me from the family table, she'd made explicit what had been implicit for years, that my place in the family was conditional, dependent on my willingness to accept whatever role she assigned to me. But sitting in my apartment that morning, surrounded by my own choices and breathing my own air, I could see the pattern clearly for the first time. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my perception for so long had finally lifted, replaced by a crystal-clear understanding of what had been happening and why I'd felt so lost and diminished in my own family. My phone rang around 10 o'clock, startling me out of my contemplation. For a moment my heart jumped with the possibility that someone from my family was calling to apologize, to explain that they'd realized their mistake and wanted to make things right. Instead, the caller ID showed Linda Brooks, my mother, and I could predict with depressing accuracy what this conversation would entail. Linda's voice when I answered was carefully modulated, the tone she used when she was trying to manage a delicate situation without taking sides. She asked how I was feeling, whether I'd slept well, if I was taking care of myself. The subtext was clear: she was checking to see if I'd come to my senses overnight, if I was ready to apologize for making Christmas dinner uncomfortable for everyone else. When I told her I was fine, that I'd actually slept better than I had after a family gathering in years, there was a pause that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Linda said that she'd been thinking about what had happened, that she understood I'd been upset, but that perhaps there had been some misunderstanding about Victoria's intention. She explained that Victoria had been under a lot of stress at work lately, that the promotion she'd received had come with significant pressure to prove herself worthy of the increased responsibility. Linda suggested that maybe Victoria's behavior had been influenced by her own anxiety, rather than any desire to hurt me, that perhaps I'd misinterpreted her suggestion about eating outside as something more malicious than it was intended to be. The conversation followed the script I'd heard countless times before, the careful reframing of Victoria's cruelty as stress-related behavior that I should understand and forgive. Linda wasn't calling to acknowledge that what had happened was wrong. She was calling to manage the situation, to smooth over the conflict so that family harmony could be restored without anyone having to admit fault or make real change. When I tried to explain that this hadn't been an isolated incident, that Christmas Eve had been the culmination of years of increasingly hostile treatment, Linda's tone shifted slightly. She became more defensive, suggesting that siblings sometimes had complicated relationships, but that didn't mean anyone was being deliberately hurtful. She reminded me that Victoria loved me, that we'd been close as children, that family relationships required work and forgiveness from everyone involved. The implication was clear: I was being oversensitive, holding grudges, failing to do my part to maintain family harmony. The responsibility for fixing the relationship was being placed on my shoulders, just as it always had been. I was expected to be the bigger person, to overlook Victoria's behavior, to find ways to accommodate her need for control while pretending that my own needs didn't matter. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of that expectation, the ingrained habit of prioritizing everyone else's comfort over my own well-being. It would have been so easy to apologize, to agree that I'd overreacted, to promise to try harder to get along with Victoria in the future. That response would have restored the peace, allowed everyone to pretend that Christmas Eve had been just a minor misunderstanding rather than a revelation of fundamental dysfunction. But I couldn't do it. Something had shifted inside me during those hours on the porch, something that couldn't be shifted back. I'd seen too clearly how the family dynamic actually worked, had felt too deeply the relief of choosing my own dignity, to go back to pretending that things were fine when they weren't. I told Linda that I loved her, that I loved all of them, but that I wasn't willing to continue accepting treatment that diminished my worth as a person. I explained that Victoria's behavior hadn't been about stress or misunderstanding. It had been about establishing dominance and control. I said that until someone could acknowledge what had actually happened and why it was unacceptable, I needed to maintain some distance from family gatherings. The silence that followed my words was heavy with disappointment and disapproval. When Linda finally spoke again, her voice had taken on the martyred tone she used when she felt that someone was being unreasonable and making her life more difficult. She said she was sorry I felt that way, that she hoped I would reconsider my position, that family was too important to let pride get in the way of reconciliation. The word pride hit me like a slap. It was such a perfect encapsulation of how my family viewed my decision to protect my own dignity. In their minds, refusing to accept mistreatment wasn't an act of self-respect. It was pride, stubbornness, an inability to be the bigger person. They couldn't conceive of a world where I might have legitimate grievances that deserved acknowledgement rather than dismissal. After I hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time, processing the conversation and what it revealed about my family's capacity for change. The call had confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to fully accept. They weren't going to suddenly develop insight into their own behavior. They weren't going to realize that their treatment of me had been wrong and commit to doing better. They were going to continue operating according to the same dynamics that had led to Christmas Eve's humiliation, expecting me to accommodate those dynamics rather than challenging them to evolve. The afternoon brought another phone call, this one from Kevin. His approach was different from Linda's, more casual and brotherly, but the underlying message was the same. He started by joking about how dramatic I'd been, leaving dinner like that, really making a statement. His tone suggested that he viewed my departure as a kind of performance, an attention-seeking gesture rather than a genuine response to unacceptable treatment. Kevin told me that he understood I was frustrated with Victoria, that she could be intense sometimes, but that she meant well and I should probably just let it go. He said that holding on to anger wasn't good for me, that life was too short to let family disagreements drag on, that everyone would be happier if we could just move past this and get back to normal. He mentioned that he and Sarah had driven back to Portland that morning, that they'd had a great time at dinner after I left, that everyone had been talking about what a successful evening it had been. The implication was clear. My presence hadn't been missed, my absence hadn't diminished anyone's enjoyment, and my grievances were an unnecessary complication to what would otherwise be a perfectly harmonious family dynamic. When I tried to explain to Kevin what had actually happened, why being excluded from Christmas dinner was more than just a minor slight, he brushed off my concerns with the casual dismissiveness I'd come to expect from him. He said that Victoria had probably just been trying to help me get some perspective, that maybe some time alone to think had been exactly what I needed, that I was probably making a bigger deal out of this than it warranted. The conversation with Kevin was in some ways more painful than the one with Linda, because it revealed how completely he'd absorbed the family narrative about my role as the problematic one. He genuinely couldn't see why I was upset, couldn't understand why exclusion and humiliation might be harmful, couldn't imagine that Victoria might be capable of deliberately cruel behavior. His blindness wasn't malicious, it was the natural result of being insulated from the treatment I'd been receiving. As the golden child who'd never been on the receiving end of Victoria's manipulations, he'd never had to develop the sensitivity to recognize subtle forms of abuse. His position in the family hierarchy protected him from experiencing what I experienced, which made it easy for him to dismiss my reality as oversensitivity or drama. After Kevin's call, I turned off my phone and spent the rest of the day in intentional solitude. I cooked myself a simple dinner, read a book I'd been meaning to get to for months, took a long bath with candles and music that I actually enjoyed rather than background noise designed to please everyone else. The quiet was profound, restorative in a way I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time in years, I wasn't monitoring my environment for signs of tension or disapproval. I wasn't calculating what I should say or do to maintain harmony or avoid conflict. I wasn't performing gratitude for treatment that made me feel small and unwelcome. I was simply existing as myself, without apology or explanation or the constant fear that I might somehow lose my tenuous place in other people's lives. The next morning brought a text from Victoria herself, the first direct communication I'd received from her since Christmas Eve. The message was characteristically brief and carefully worded, designed to sound reasonable while avoiding any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She wrote that she hoped I'd had time to cool down and gain some perspective on what had happened, that she was willing to have a conversation about moving forward if I was ready to be mature about the situation. The language was perfect, Victoria positioning herself as the rational adult dealing with a temperamental child, offering magnanimous forgiveness for my unreasonable behavior while implying that any reconciliation would require me to admit fault and modify my expectation. She wasn't apologizing, she was offering me an opportunity to apologize to her for making Christmas dinner awkward by refusing to accept exile gracefully. I stared at the message for a long time, marveling at the audacity of it. Even now, even after forcing me to eat outside like an unwelcome animal, Victoria couldn't conceive of a scenario where she might bear responsibility for the conflict. In her mind, I was the problem that needed to be solved, the source of dysfunction that needed to be managed, the family member who couldn't handle the reasonable expectations that everyone else accepted without complaint. I didn't respond to the text, which I knew would be interpreted as continued stubbornness rather than a boundary. In Victoria's world, silence wasn't consent to leave me alone. It was evidence that I was still being difficult and needed more pressure to return to my assigned role. My lack of response would likely trigger escalation rather than reflection, more attempts to manage me back into compliance rather than examination of the behavior that had caused the conflict. That afternoon, while I was doing laundry in the basement of Pinwood Apartments, I encountered Miss Thompson, loading her own clothes into one of the washers. She was a woman in her 70s who'd lived in the building longer than anyone else, a retired librarian whose apartment was filled with books and whose conversation always contained small gems of wisdom wrapped in observations about daily life. She asked how my Christmas had been, a simple question that most people ask out of politeness without expecting an honest answer, but something about her genuine interest in the peaceful isolation of the laundry room made me tell her the truth. I found myself explaining about the dinner, about being excluded from my own family's celebration, about the years of gradually increasing hostility that had led to that moment. Miss Thompson listened without interrupting, folding her clothes with the methodical care of someone who'd learned that small rituals could provide comfort during difficult times. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a moment, considering what I'd shared. Finally, she told me something that shifted my perspective in a way I hadn't expected. She said that in her 73 years, she'd learned to recognize the difference between people who loved you for who you were, and people who loved their idea of who you should be. She explained that the first kind of love felt like coming home, like being seen and accepted for your authentic self. The second kind felt like being on stage, constantly performing to earn approval that could be withdrawn at any moment if your performance wasn't satisfactory. She told me that real love didn't require you to make yourself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. Real love didn't demand that you accept mistreatment in the name of keeping the peace. Real love didn't use exclusion and humiliation as tools to modify your behavior or teach you lessons about your place in the hierarchy. Miss Thompson said that she'd raised 4 children and watched them navigate their own relationships, and she'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you could do for people was to stop enabling their worst impulses. Sometimes refusing to accept unacceptable behavior was the only way to create space for healthier dynamics to develop. She folded the last of her laundry and looked at me directly, her eyes kind but serious. She told me that she'd observed me over the months I'd lived in the building, noticed how I always seemed to be apologizing for taking up space, how I approached interactions with a kind of careful anxiety that suggested I'd learned to expect rejection or criticism. She said she'd wondered what had taught me to move through the world with such caution, and now she understood. As I carried my clean clothes back to my apartment, Mrs. Thompson's words echoed in my mind. The distinction she'd drawn between different kinds of love felt like a key that unlocked a door I hadn't even realized was closed. I'd been so focused on maintaining my place in my family that I'd never questioned whether that place was worth maintaining, whether the love they offered was the kind that nourished or the kind that diminished. That evening I did something I hadn't done in years. I made plans that were based solely on what I wanted to do rather than what would maintain family harmony or avoid conflict. I called the community center and signed up for a pottery class that started in January. I researched volunteer opportunities at the local animal shelter. I made a list of books I wanted to read, places I wanted to visit, skills I wanted to develop. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was thinking about my life in terms of my own desires and interests rather than other people's expectations. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff and discovering that I could fly rather than fall. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed quietly, a stretch of peaceful solitude that allowed me to process what had happened and begin imagining what might come next. I didn't hear from my family again, which confirmed that they were waiting for me to make the first move toward reconciliation on their terms. The silence that had once felt like punishment now felt like space, room to breathe and think and remember who I was when I wasn't constantly adapting to other people's moods and expectations. On December 27th, the property management office reopened after the holiday break. I'd been considering whether to renew my lease when it came up in March, wondering if I should look for something bigger or in a different neighborhood. But as I walked through the halls of Pinwood Apartments, past the doors of neighbors who treated me with casual kindness, through the restored gardens where Mrs. Thompson walked Buster every morning, I realized that this building had become more of a home than my family house had ever been. Here I was valued for my reliability as a tenant, appreciated for my friendliness without having to perform it, accepted without having to earn it, through constant accommodation of other people's needs. The relationships were simpler, cleaner, based on mutual respect rather than complicated family dynamics. The building manager, Marcus Chen, had always been professional and responsive, treating all tenants with equal courtesy regardless of their background or circumstance. I'd interacted with Marcus several times over the months I'd lived in the building, mostly for routine maintenance requests or questions about building policy. He was probably in his mid-30s with an easy smile and a calm competence that made residents feel confident that their concerns would be handled efficiently. Unlike my family's conditional acceptance, Marcus's professionalism was consistent and reliable, something I could count on without having to worry about whether I'd somehow earned. The thought of Marcus's straightforward kindness compared to my family's complicated emotional manipulation crystallized something important for me. I'd been so focused on the intensity of family relationships, the highs and lows of love and conflict and reconciliation, that I'd forgotten how peaceful it could be to interact with people who treated you with simple human decency. I'd mistaken drama for depth, emotional volatility for authentic connection. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years after any interaction involving my family. Not the exhausted calm that followed a successful performance, but genuine tranquility born from being exactly where I belonged, exactly as I was. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but tonight I was home in the truest sense of the word. Little did I know that tomorrow would bring a phone call that would change everything, a conversation that would reveal secrets my family had been keeping for years and transform my understanding of why Victoria had been so determined to diminish my place in the family hierarchy. But that night I fell asleep surrounded by my own choices, breathing my own air, dreaming my own dreams, finally free from the weight of other people's expectations, and the exhausting effort to earn love that should have been unconditional. The call came at exactly 9:15 on the morning of December 28th, while I was standing in my kitchen making oatmeal and watching the rain create intricate patterns on the window glass. The caller ID displayed Pacific Northwest Property Solutions, which struck me as odd since I hadn't submitted any maintenance requests and my rent wasn't due for another week. For a moment I wondered if there was some building-wide issue that required notification, perhaps a water shutoff or scheduled repairs. Marcus Chen's voice on the other end was different from the casual professionalism I'd come to expect from our previous interaction. There was something careful in his tone, almost tentative, as if he were navigating unfamiliar territory. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk, explaining that something had come to his attention that might be of interest to me. The formal phrasing was unlike his usual direct communication style,
and I found myself setting down my spoon and giving him my full attention. He began by mentioning that he'd been reviewing property records as part of year-end administrative tasks, cross-referencing tenant information with ownership documentation and historical filing. It was routine work, he explained, the kind of detailed record-keeping that most people never thought about, but that kept property management companies operating smoothly. As he spoke, I could hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of someone organizing documents while trying to decide how to deliver unexpected news.
What Marcus had discovered, he said carefully, was an irregularity in the ownership records for Pinwood Apartments. The building was currently owned by a holding company called Cedar Ridge Investments, which was itself a subsidiary of a larger corporation that managed various real estate holdings throughout Oregon and Washington. That much was standard, he explained, the kind of layered ownership structure that was common in commercial real estate. But when he'd traced the ownership chain back through several years of records, examining the documents that showed how Cedar Ridge Investments had acquired the property, he'd found something unexpected. The building had been purchased in 2019 from the estate of Eleanor Brooks, who had died 6 months earlier and left the property to her heirs. The transaction had been handled through lawyers and had apparently been completed quickly, with the family eager to convert the real estate into liquid assets. The name Brooks had caught Marcus's attention because it was my last name, and when he'd cross-referenced the documentation, he'd discovered something that made him think he should reach out to me directly. According to the estate records, Eleanor Brooks had left Pinwood Apartments to be divided equally among her 4 grandchildren: Victoria Brooks, Kevin Brooks, Natalie Brooks, and Michael Brooks. The words hit me like cold water. Eleanor Brooks was my grandmother, my father's mother, who had died when I was 26. I remembered the funeral, the family gathering afterward, the discussions about her will and the various bequests she'd made to different family members. But I had no memory of anyone mentioning that she'd left me a share of any property, certainly not a share of the building where I now lived as a paying tenant. Marcus continued explaining what he'd found, his voice growing more confident as he realized the significance of what he was telling me. The estate records showed that Eleanor had inherited Pinwood Apartments from her own parents in the 1970s and had maintained ownership until her death. She'd lived in one of the units for several years before moving to assisted living, and she'd apparently been quite attached to the building and its history. According to the will, each grandchild was supposed to receive a 25% stake in the property, with the understanding that they could either maintain joint ownership or sell their shares to the others if they preferred not to be involved in property management. The will had been very specific about ensuring that all 4 grandchildren were informed of their inheritance and given the opportunity to participate in decisions about the building's future. But Marcus had found no record of me ever being contacted about the inheritance, no documentation showing that I'd been informed of my ownership stake or given the opportunity to participate in the decision to sell. The sale to Cedar Ridge Investments had been completed with signatures from only 3 of the 4 heirs: Victoria, Kevin, and Michael. My signature was nowhere to be found in the transaction documents. The silence stretched between us as I processed what Marcus was telling me. My grandmother had left me a share of valuable real estate, property that I'd been living in and paying rent on for months without knowing that I was supposed to be one of the owners. My family had sold my inheritance without telling me, had allowed me to become a tenant in a building where I should have been a landlord. Marcus seemed to understand the magnitude of what he'd revealed, because his next words were carefully chosen. He explained that what he'd discovered raised serious legal questions about the validity of the sale, since property couldn't be legally transferred without the consent of all owners. He said that he wasn't a lawyer and couldn't provide legal advice, but that the situation was irregular enough that I might want to consult with an attorney who specialized in estate and property law. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Cedar Ridge Investments was owned by Patterson Holdings, which was itself controlled by Patterson and Associates. The name was familiar, and it took me a moment to remember where I'd heard it before. Patterson and Associates was the marketing firm where Victoria worked, the company that had given her the promotion and financial success that had elevated her status within our family. The connection was too significant to be coincidental. Victoria hadn't just failed to inform me about my inheritance, she'd apparently arranged for her own employer to purchase the property, possibly at below market value since the sale had been completed quickly and without all the required signature. She'd literally stolen my inheritance and then profited from it through her professional connections. Marcus asked if I was still there, his voice gentle with concern. I realized I'd been silent for several minutes, trying to absorb the implications of what he'd told me. When I confirmed that I was listening, he continued with information that made the situation even more complex. He explained that over the past few months, he'd been receiving pressure from Cedar Ridge Investments to increase rents significantly across all units in the building. The company claimed that the building was underperforming financially and that substantial rent increases were necessary to bring the property in line with market rate. Marcus had been resisting these demands because he felt they were excessive and would force out long-term tenants who contributed to the building's stable, community-oriented atmosphere. The pressure had intensified recently, with Cedar Ridge threatening to replace Marcus's management company if he didn't implement their rent increase demands by the end of January. They'd specifically mentioned my unit as an example of underperformance, claiming that a one-bedroom apartment should be generating significantly more revenue than what I was currently paying. Marcus said he'd been preparing to have difficult conversations with tenants about substantial rent increases, including me, when he'd discovered the ownership irregularities. Now he was wondering if the pressure to increase rents was related to the questionable nature of the property acquisition. If the sale hadn't been legal, then Cedar Ridge's ownership of the building might be invalid, which would certainly explain their eagerness to maximize profits quickly. As Marcus spoke, pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place in my mind. Victoria's increased hostility toward me over the past year hadn't just been about establishing dominance within the family. It had been about protecting a secret that could expose her to serious legal consequence. My growing independence, my refusal to accept her authority without question, my potential to discover information that could threaten her carefully constructed success story, all of these things made me a liability that needed to be controlled or eliminated. The Christmas Eve dinner incident took on new significance in this context. Victoria's decision to exclude me from the family gathering hadn't just been about humiliation, it had been about sending a clear message that I didn't belong, that I should accept my marginalized status and stop asking questions that might lead to uncomfortable discovery. By treating me like an outsider in my own family, she'd been reinforcing the narrative that I didn't deserve consideration or inclusion in important family matters. Marcus interrupted my racing thoughts to ask what I wanted to do with the information he'd provided. He explained that he felt obligated to inform me about what he'd discovered, but that any decisions about how to proceed would be entirely mine. He mentioned that he'd made copies of all the relevant documents and would be happy to provide them to me, or to any attorney I chose to consult. He also said something that revealed the depth of his character and his understanding of the human dimensions of legal complication. He told me that regardless of what legal action I might choose to pursue, he wanted me to know that I would continue to be welcome in Pinwood Apartments for as long as I wanted to stay. He said that in his months of working with me as a tenant, I'd proven myself to be exactly the kind of resident that made buildings feel like communities rather than just collections of rental units. The contrast between Marcus's straightforward decency and my family's elaborate deceptions was so stark that it almost made me laugh. Here was someone I barely knew, someone whose relationship with me was purely professional, showing more concern for my well-being and more respect for my rights than the people who claimed to love me unconditionally. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at my cooling oatmeal and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. My grandmother had tried to provide for me, had wanted to ensure that I had financial security and a stake in something valuable and permanent. Victoria had stolen that gift, had denied me not just money, but the sense of belonging and security that property ownership could provide. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took my breath away. This wasn't a matter of family dynamics or personality conflicts or different approaches to showing love. This was fraud, theft, deliberate deception designed to enrich Victoria at my expense, while keeping me dependent and vulnerable. I thought about all the times Victoria had made condescending comments about my financial situation, all the suggestions that I needed to be more responsible with money, all the implications that my struggles to afford a bigger apartment or nicer clothes were evidence of personal failing. She'd been criticizing me for poverty that she'd created, mocking me for insecurity that she'd engineered, positioning herself as successful by comparison to disadvantages she'd imposed on me. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not only had Victoria stolen my inheritance, but she'd used my resulting financial struggles as evidence of my inadequacy, as justification for treating me as lesser, as proof that her judgment was superior to mine. She'd created a narrative in which she was the responsible, successful daughter and I was the disappointing failure, and she'd built that narrative on a foundation of theft and deception. I found myself thinking about Michael, the cousin mentioned in the estate records whom I rarely saw anymore. Michael was Robert's nephew, the son of his brother who died in a car accident when Michael was 15. He'd been raised primarily by his maternal grandparents after that, maintaining some connection to our family but never becoming fully integrated into our regular gathering. Michael's inclusion in the inheritance made sense. Eleanor had always been fond of him, and had maintained contact even after his father's death. But his distance from our immediate family would have made it easier for Victoria to manipulate the situation, to convince him to go along with a quick sale without asking too many questions about whether all the heirs had been properly notified. I realized I had no way to contact Michael directly, no recent phone number or address. Our family had always been the connection point for any communication with him, which meant that Victoria could have easily controlled what information he received about the inheritance and the proposed sale. If he'd been told that all the heirs were in agreement about selling quickly, he would have had no reason to question the process. The more I thought about the timeline, the more sinister Victoria's behavior became. Eleanor had died in early 2019, and Victoria's career success had accelerated dramatically in the months that followed. Her promotion at Patterson and Associates, her increased income, her growing confidence and authority within our family, all of these developments had coincided with the period when she should have been notifying me about the inheritance. Instead of sharing the windfall that our grandmother had intended for all of us, Victoria had apparently used her position at Patterson and Associates to arrange a favorable purchase of the property for her employer's investment arm. She'd profited professionally from the transaction while denying me the financial security that Eleanor had tried to provide. The psychological manipulation that had preceded and followed the theft was almost as devastating as the financial loss. Victoria had spent years conditioning me to doubt my own judgment, to accept her authority over family matters, to believe that my struggles were evidence of personal inadequacy, rather than external circumstance. She'd systematically undermined my confidence, so that I would be less likely to ask questions, less likely to assert my rights, less likely to challenge her version of events. Christmas Eve's humiliation took on even darker significance in this context. Victoria hadn't just been establishing dominance, she'd been testing how much abuse I would accept without fighting back. If I'd quietly eaten my dinner outside, and returned to family gatherings as if nothing had happened, she would have known that her secret was safe, that I could be controlled and marginalized indefinitely without risk of exposure. My decision to walk away, to refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, had probably triggered panic rather than just anger. Victoria wasn't just losing control over a difficult family member, she was losing control over someone who might eventually discover information that could destroy her career and expose her to serious legal consequences. I spent the rest of the morning researching estate law and property fraud, trying to understand my legal options, and the potential consequences for Victoria if I chose to pursue them. The information I found was both encouraging and daunting. Property fraud was a serious crime with significant penalties, but proving it would require extensive documentation and potentially lengthy legal proceedings. The strongest evidence in my favor was the fact that my signature was missing from the sale documents, which should have made the transaction invalid from the beginning. But Victoria's lawyers had apparently found ways to proceed without my consent, possibly by claiming that I couldn't be located or that I'd waived my rights through some legal technicality. The involvement of Patterson and Associates added another layer of complexity, since it suggested that Victoria's employer might have knowingly participated in questionable dealing. If the company had purchased property without ensuring that all legal requirements were met, they could face their own liability issues, which might motivate them to resolve the situation quietly rather than risk public exposure. As I read through legal websites and consultation services, I realized that pursuing this case would require resources I didn't currently have. Attorneys who specialized in complex property fraud cases charged substantial fees, and while some worked on contingency basis, I would still need money for court costs and expert witnesses and other expenses that could add up quickly. The irony was bitter. I couldn't afford to fight for my stolen inheritance, because Victoria had successfully stolen my inheritance. She'd created a situation where my financial limitations, which she'd helped create, would protect her from consequences for the theft that had created those limitations. But even as I wrestled with the practical challenges, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: righteous anger. Not the confused hurt and self-doubt that usually followed Victoria's attacks, but clear, clean fury at the magnitude of her betrayal. She hadn't just been a difficult sister, she'd been a criminal who'd stolen from her own family while manipulating them into believing they deserved the resulting hardship. That afternoon, I called 3 different law firms that advertised experience with estate and property disputes. The first 2 consultations were discouraging. The attorneys were interested in the case, but required substantial retainers that I couldn't afford. The complexity of proving fraud across multiple years and jurisdictions would make the case expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. The third call, however, yielded more promising results. Jennifer Walsh at Morrison & Associates explained that they occasionally took complex fraud cases on a contingency basis, if the evidence was strong enough, and the potential recovery was substantial. She agreed to review the documents that Marcus had provided and give me a preliminary assessment of whether the case was worth pursuing. Jennifer's voice was professional but warm, and she seemed genuinely interested in the human dimensions of what had happened, rather than just the financial aspect. She explained that estate fraud often involved family members taking advantage of their access to information and their ability to manipulate other relatives, making it both legally complex and emotionally devastating for victims. She also mentioned something that gave me hope. Recent changes in Oregon law had strengthened protections for inheritance beneficiaries and increased penalties for people who fraudulently interfered with estate distribution. If we could prove that Victoria had deliberately concealed my inheritance and manipulated the sale process, she could face both civil liability and criminal charges. Jennifer asked me to gather any documentation I had about Eleanor's death, the estate proceedings, and my family's communication about the inheritance. She also suggested that I request copies of all relevant records from the county clerk's office and the estate court, building a complete paper trail that would show exactly what had happened and when. As I hung up from that call, I felt something shift inside me, a sense of possibility and power that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I wasn't just reacting to Victoria's manipulation, I was taking active steps to expose the truth and seek justice for what had been done to me. The evening brought another text from Victoria, this one more insistent than the previous day's message. She wrote that she was disappointed by my continued silence, that my refusal to communicate was childish and hurtful to the whole family. She said that she was willing to overlook my dramatic exit from Christmas dinner if I was ready to have a mature conversation about moving forward. The timing of her message, coming just hours after my conversation with Marcus, struck me as significant. Was it possible that she knew about Marcus's discovery? Did she have contacts within the property management industry who might have alerted her to someone asking questions about Pinwood Apartments? Or was she simply escalating her pressure campaign because my continued absence was making her nervous? I stared at her text for a long time, marveling at the audacity of someone who'd stolen my inheritance lecturing me about maturity and family responsibility. The psychological manipulation was so complete, so perfectly calibrated, that I could almost admire its craftsmanship even as I despised its intent. But I didn't respond to Victoria's text. Instead, I spent the evening organizing the documents that Marcus had provided, creating a timeline of events surrounding Eleanor's death and the property sale, preparing the foundation for what might become a legal battle that would finally expose the truth about my family's carefully maintained facade. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving toward something rather than away from something. I was moving toward justice, toward truth, toward the financial security that my grandmother had tried to provide for me. I was moving toward a future where Victoria's power over me would be broken not by my withdrawal from the family but by the exposure of her crimes. As I prepared for bed that night,
I felt a strange sense of anticipation rather than the dread that usually accompanied thoughts of family conflict. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and probably painful confrontation. But it would also bring the possibility of justice, the chance to reclaim what had been stolen from me, and the opportunity to honor my grandmother's intentions by fighting for the inheritance she'd wanted me to have. The phone call from Marcus had changed everything, had transformed me from a victim of family dysfunction into someone with real power to seek justice and expose the truth. Victoria had spent years teaching me that I was powerless, that I should accept whatever treatment she chose to give me, that questioning her authority would only lead to more punishment. But now I knew something she didn't know I knew. I had evidence of her crimes, legal options for seeking justice, and allies who were willing to help me fight for what was rightfully mine. The balance of power had shifted, and Victoria had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. The documents spread across my kitchen table told a story of systematic deception that was even more elaborate than I'd initially understood. Jennifer Walsh had spent 3 days reviewing everything Marcus had provided, along with additional records I'd obtained from the county courthouse and the estate administration office. When she called to schedule our meeting, her voice carried the controlled excitement of a lawyer who'd found a case with both strong evidence and significant stakes. Jennifer's office occupied the corner suite of a restored brick building in downtown Cedar Falls, with tall windows that overlooked the Cascade River and walls lined with law books that suggested serious scholarship rather than flashy advertising. She was probably in her early 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct gaze that made it clear she didn't waste time on pleasantries when there was important work to be done. She began our meeting by laying out a timeline that transformed my understanding of how long Victoria's deception had been in planning. According to the estate records, Eleanor had updated her will in December 2018, just 3 months before her death. The timing suggested that she'd been thinking carefully about how to provide for her grandchildren, making deliberate choices about how to distribute her assets in ways that would benefit each of us according to our individual needs and circumstances. Eleanor had left cash bequests to Victoria and Kevin, acknowledging their established careers and financial stability, but she'd left the property to all 4 grandchildren equally, recognizing that real estate provided a different kind of security than liquid assets. The will included specific language about her hope that the building would remain in the family, continuing to provide affordable housing while generating income for her descendants. Jennifer explained that the will had been filed with the probate court in March 2019, meaning that Victoria had known about my inheritance within weeks of Eleanor's death. But instead of contacting me immediately, she'd apparently spent months developing a strategy to acquire my share of the property without my knowledge or consent. The legal machinations were complex but devastating in their thoroughness. Victoria had hired a law firm that specialized in estate administration, claiming that she needed help locating all the beneficiaries mentioned in the will. She'd provided them with contact information for Kevin and Michael, but had told them that she'd lost touch with me after a family disagreement and wasn't sure how to reach me. The lawyers had made what they claimed were good faith efforts to locate me, running advertisements in newspapers and hiring a skip tracing service that somehow failed to find me, despite the fact that I'd been living in the same apartment and working at easily traceable jobs throughout the entire period. Jennifer's review of their search efforts revealed procedures so perfunctory that they bordered on deliberate incompetence. After 6 months of these supposedly unsuccessful attempts to locate me, Victoria had petitioned the court to proceed with estate administration without my participation. She'd argued that further delays would be costly and that the other beneficiaries shouldn't be penalized because one heir couldn't be found. The court had granted her petition, appointing her as the administrator with authority to manage the estate's assets. Jennifer showed me copies of documents that revealed Victoria's next move in the scheme. As estate administrator, she'd commissioned an appraisal of Pinwood Apartments that valued the property at significantly less than its actual market worth. The appraisal had been conducted by a firm that had previous business relationships with Patterson and Associates, creating a conflict of interest that should have been disclosed but apparently wasn't. Using this artificially low valuation, Victoria had then approached her employer about purchasing the property as an investment opportunity. She'd presented it as a chance for Patterson Holdings to acquire undervalued real estate with significant upside potential, failing to mention that she had personal financial interest in the transaction, or that one of the required sellers hadn't actually consented to the sale. The purchase had been completed in November 2019, with Victoria, Kevin, and Michael each receiving approximately $75,000 for their shares of the property. According to Jennifer's analysis, a proper appraisal would have valued each share at closer to $120,000, meaning that even the other heirs had been shortchanged in addition to my complete exclusion from the transaction. But the financial theft was only part of the story. Jennifer had also uncovered evidence of what she called inheritance laundering, a process by which Victoria had used her position at Patterson and Associates to profit from the stolen property in multiple ways. Not only had she received a finder's fee for bringing the investment opportunity to her employer's attention, but she'd also been assigned to manage the marketing and leasing strategy for the building after the purchase. Victoria's compensation from these additional services had totaled nearly $30,000 over the past 2 years. Money she'd earned by exploiting property that she'd helped steal from. She'd literally built part of her career success on the foundation of my stolen inheritance, using her fraud to generate ongoing professional opportunities and financial reward. Jennifer explained that this pattern of behavior elevated Victoria's actions from simple estate fraud to what could be considered racketeering under federal law. The systematic use of deception, fraud, and her position within a business organization to generate ongoing profits from criminal activity met the legal definition of a criminal enterprise, potentially exposing her to much more serious charges than basic theft. The scope of the legal exposure wasn't limited to Victoria. Patterson and Associates had purchased property without ensuring that all legal requirements were met, had employed someone to manage property that had been fraudulently acquired, and had potentially benefited from insider information that gave them an unfair advantage in the transaction.
The company could face civil liability, regulatory sanctions, and criminal charges depending on how much their executives knew about the irregular nature of the purchase. Jennifer's analysis had also revealed something that made the case even stronger from a legal standpoint. The advertisements that Victoria's lawyers had run in newspapers to supposedly locate me had been placed in publications outside the Cedar Falls area, in cities where I'd never lived and had no connections. Meanwhile, they'd never attempted to contact me through any of the local businesses where I'd worked, never checked with the post office for forwarding addresses, never used any of the standard methods that competent investigators would employ. The evidence suggested deliberate incompetence rather than good faith effort, a pattern designed to create the appearance of compliance with legal requirements while ensuring that I would never actually be contacted. Jennifer believed this would be relatively easy to prove in court, since standard skip tracing procedures were well documented, and the contrast between proper methods and what had actually been done would be obvious to any jury. As Jennifer continued laying out the case, I found myself feeling a mixture of vindication and overwhelming sadness. Vindication, because finally someone with expertise was confirming that what had been done to me was wrong, illegal, and prosecutable, but sadness because the evidence revealed a level of premeditation and callousness that was difficult to reconcile with any conception of sisterly love or family loyalty. Victoria hadn't made an impulsive decision to exclude me from an inheritance. She'd spent months planning how to steal from me, had enlisted lawyers and appraisers and business associates in her scheme, had created false documentation, and manufactured justifications for her action. The betrayal was so complete and so carefully orchestrated that it revealed someone capable of extraordinary cruelty disguised as competence and concern. Jennifer asked what I wanted to do with the information she'd compiled. She explained that I had several options, ranging from private negotiation to full criminal prosecution, each with different risks and potential outcomes. A private settlement might result in faster financial recovery, but would allow Victoria to avoid criminal consequences and potentially continue similar behavior in the future. Criminal prosecution would ensure justice but might take years to resolve and could be emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The civil case alone would be substantial, Jennifer explained. I could sue for the full value of my stolen inheritance, plus damages for the lost investment returns I would have earned over the past 2 years, plus punitive damages for the fraudulent nature of Victoria's conduct. The total claim could easily exceed $300,000, a sum that would certainly get Victoria's attention and potentially bankrupt her if she couldn't afford to pay. But Jennifer also cautioned that pursuing the case would likely destroy any possibility of reconciliation with my family. Victoria would almost certainly try to rally Robert, Linda, and Kevin to her defense, painting me as vindictive and money-hungry for pursuing legal action against my own sister. The case would become public record, exposing the family's private dysfunction to community scrutiny and potentially damaging everyone's reputation. She asked if I was prepared for that level of conflict and publicity, if I was emotionally ready to withstand the pressure that Victoria would undoubtedly bring to bear to force me to drop the case. Jennifer had seen many family fraud cases where victims were ultimately worn down by the emotional manipulation and social pressure that followed exposure of financial crimes between relatives. I told Jennifer that I needed time to think about my options, to consider not just the legal and financial implications, but the personal and emotional consequences of different approaches. She agreed to hold the case file while I made my decision, but warned that there were statutes of limitations that would eventually foreclose some of my options if I waited too long to act. As I drove home from Jennifer's office, I felt the weight of carrying knowledge that could destroy my family as I'd always known it. The evidence was clear, the legal path was available, but the decision about whether to pursue justice would ultimately rest with me. For the first time in my adult life, I held real power over Victoria, the ability to expose her crimes and demand accountability for her actions. The irony wasn't lost on me that this power had come through the very inheritance that Victoria had tried to deny me. Eleanor's gift wasn't just the property itself, but the paper trail that documented Victoria's theft and the legal standing that would allow me to fight for justice. My grandmother had provided me with the tools to protect myself even from beyond the grave, even from threats she couldn't have anticipated. That evening, I sat in my apartment, looking out at the restored gardens of Pinwood Apartments, thinking about the strange circular nature of what had happened. I'd been living in and paying rent on property that I actually owned, unknowingly supporting the very people who'd stolen from me. Victoria had been earning money from managing a building where her victim lived as a tenant, profiting from my presence while keeping me ignorant of my rights. The psychological manipulation made more sense now, viewed through the lens of Victoria's criminal behavior. Her systematic efforts to undermine my confidence, to make me doubt my own judgment, to position herself as the competent sister dealing with a problematic sibling. All of these tactics had served to protect her from discovery, while ensuring that I remained dependent and vulnerable. My financial struggles, which Victoria had often cited as evidence of my personal inadequacy, had been largely caused by the theft of resources that should have provided me with stability and opportunity. She'd stolen my inheritance and then mocked me for the poverty that resulted from her theft, creating a cruel feedback loop where her crimes generated ongoing justification for treating me as lesser. The Christmas Eve incident took on even darker significance in this context. Victoria's decision to exclude me from the family dinner hadn't been about establishing dominance or teaching me lessons about my place in the hierarchy. It had been about testing whether I could be pushed to the breaking point without fighting back, whether she could escalate her abuse without risking exposure of her secrets. My refusal to accept exile, my decision to walk away rather than endure humiliation, had probably triggered genuine panic. If I was willing to prioritize my own dignity over family harmony, I might also be willing to ask questions about other family matters, to demand information about inheritances and estate settlements, and other topics that Victoria needed to keep off limits. The pressure she'd been applying since Christmas Eve, the texts demanding that I return to my assigned role and the family members enlisted to convince me to be more reasonable, all of these efforts were probably motivated by fear rather than just anger. Victoria wasn't just trying to re-establish control over a difficult family member, she was trying to contain someone who represented an existential threat to her freedom and reputation. As I considered Jennifer's question about what I wanted to do with the information I now possessed, I realized that the decision wasn't just about money or legal justice. It was about the kind of person I wanted to be, the kind of life I wanted to live, the kind of relationships I was willing to accept as normal and healthy. For years I'd been taught that family loyalty meant accepting whatever treatment my relatives chose to give me, that questioning authority or demanding respect was selfish and destructive. I'd been conditioned to believe that keeping the peace was more important than protecting my own interests, that accommodation was a virtue even when it enabled abuse. But the evidence Jennifer had showed me revealed the logical endpoint of that philosophy. When you teach someone that they can mistreat you without consequences, when you demonstrate that you'll prioritize their comfort over your own well-being, when you signal that your needs are less important than maintaining appearance, you create conditions where progressively worse behavior becomes normalized and eventually inevitable. Victoria's theft of my inheritance wasn't an aberration. It was the natural evolution of a dynamic where she'd learned that she could harm me without facing accountability. The Christmas Eve humiliation wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of years of testing how much abuse I would accept before pushing back. The question wasn't really whether I should pursue legal action against Victoria. The question was whether I was ready to definitively reject the family dynamic that had made her crimes possible, whether I was prepared to prioritize justice over the illusion of harmony, whether I could choose truth over the comfortable lies that had allowed everyone to avoid confronting difficult realities. My phone rang while I was lost in these contemplations, the caller ID showing a number I didn't recognize with a Portland area code. When I answered, a woman's voice asked if I was Natalie Brooks, then identified herself as Rebecca Chen, Marcus's sister and a paralegal at Morrison & Associates. She explained that Jennifer had asked her to reach out about some additional research she'd been conducting into the Pinwood Apartments case. Rebecca's findings added yet another layer to the story of Victoria's deception. While reviewing the property management records more thoroughly, she'd discovered that Cedar Ridge Investments had been planning significant changes to the building that would have displaced most of the current tenants. The rent increases that Marcus had been resisting were just the beginning of a larger transformation plan. According to internal documents that Rebecca had obtained through public records requests, Cedar Ridge intended to convert Pinwood Apartments into luxury condominiums, taking advantage of the building's historic character and desirable location to create high-end housing units that would sell for premium prices. The current tenants, with their below-market rents and long-term leases, were obstacles to this redevelopment plan. The timeline for the conversion project showed that Cedar Ridge had been planning to clear out existing tenants by the end of 2025, using rent increases and lease non-renewals to force people to move. Miss O. Thompson, who'd lived in the building for decades, would have been evicted to make way for wealthy buyers. The couple in 2C, with their Christmas movie traditions, the young professional in 1A, who worked night shifts at the hospital, all of the people who'd created the community atmosphere that made Pinwood feel like home rather than just a rental property, all of them would have been displaced to maximize profits for investors. Rebecca explained that this development plan made my legal case even stronger, because it showed that Victoria's theft hadn't just harmed me individually, but had also endangered an entire community of residents who'd depended on the building's affordable, stable housing. Eleanor's will had specifically mentioned her hope that the property would continue providing accessible housing, a wish that Victoria had completely ignored in favor of maximizing her personal profit. The revelation about the conversion plans also explained why Marcus had been under such pressure to increase rents immediately. Cedar Ridge wasn't just trying to maximize short-term revenue, they were trying to establish a rental rate baseline that would justify higher sale prices when the units were converted to condominiums. Every month that passed with below-market rents made their business plan less profitable and their timeline more compressed. As Rebecca continued explaining what she'd discovered, I realized that pursuing my case wouldn't just be about recovering my stolen inheritance or seeking justice for Victoria's betrayal. It would also be about protecting a community of people who had no idea they were living under threat, preserving affordable housing in a town where such options were becoming increasingly rare. Eleanor's gift to her grandchildren hadn't been just about providing individual financial security, it had been about maintaining a piece of Cedar Falls' character, keeping at least one beautiful historic building accessible to working people rather than exclusively available to the wealthy. Victoria's theft had perverted that intention, transforming a legacy of community service into a vehicle for gentrification and displacement. After Rebecca's call, I walked through the halls of Pinwood Apartments with new eyes, seeing not just the home I'd created for myself, but the community that dozens of people had built together over years of shared residence. Mrs. Thompson's morning walks with Buster, the holiday celebrations I could hear through thin walls, the casual friendliness between neighbors who knew each other's names and habits, all of this would disappear if Cedar Ridge's plans proceeded unopposed. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was the clarity it brought. This wasn't just about my relationship with Victoria or my family's dysfunction, or even my personal financial security. This was about the kind of world I wanted to live in, the kind of community I wanted to support, the kind of legacy I wanted to honor. Eleanor had tried to ensure that her property would continue serving people who needed affordable housing, who valued community over luxury, who understood that some things were more important than maximizing profit. Victoria had betrayed that trust for personal gain, but I had the power to expose that betrayal and potentially restore the original vision. The decision crystallized as I stood in the lobby of Pinwood Apartments, looking at the carefully restored details that reflected someone's care for preserving beauty and character, rather than just extracting maximum value. I would pursue the case, not just for my own sake, but for Eleanor's intentions and for the community that had unknowingly welcomed me into their home. Victoria had taught me that I was powerless, that I should accept whatever treatment she chose to give me, that questioning her authority would only lead to punishment and isolation, but she'd made a crucial miscalculation in her assessment of my character and capability. She'd assumed that years of conditioning would keep me passive and compliant even when faced with evidence of her crimes. What she hadn't anticipated was that her theft would provide me with both the motivation and the means to fight back effectively. The inheritance she'd stolen had created the paper trail that would expose her fraud. The building she'd tried to profit from had become the community I was determined to protect. The victim she'd thought she could control indefinitely had discovered allies, resources, and a cause worth fighting for. I called Jennifer's office the next morning and left a message that was brief but definitive. I wanted to pursue both civil and criminal charges against Victoria, to recover my stolen inheritance, and to seek justice for her betrayal of Eleanor's trust. I was prepared for whatever conflict might follow, whatever family pressure might be brought to bear, whatever personal cost might result from choosing truth over comfort. The message I left included one additional request that surprised even me as I spoke it. I asked Jennifer to explore whether there might be legal mechanisms to preserve Pinwood Apartments as affordable housing permanently, to honor Eleanor's original intentions, while ensuring that future owners couldn't repeat Victoria's betrayal of community trust. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt like I was moving toward something positive rather than just away from something harmful. I was moving toward justice, toward community, toward the kind of life where people were valued for who they were rather than what they could provide to others. Victoria had tried to teach me that I was powerless, but she'd inadvertently given me the tools to prove her wrong. The legal papers were served on a Tuesday morning in January, delivered to Victoria's pristine downtown office at Patterson and Associates, by a professional process server who later told Jennifer that he'd never seen someone's face change color so dramatically upon reading a court summons. Within 3 hours of receiving the documents, my phone began ringing with calls from family members who'd apparently been contacted in rapid succession as Victoria tried to rally support for her defense. The first call came from Robert, my father, whose voice carried a mixture of confusion and disappointment that I'd come to recognize as his standard response to family conflict. He asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss what he called a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand, suggesting that surely there was a way to resolve family disagreements without involving lawyers and courts and the kind of public spectacle that would embarrass everyone involved. When I explained that this wasn't a family disagreement, but a criminal matter involving fraud and theft, Robert's tone shifted to the careful neutrality he used when he wanted to avoid taking sides in disputes between his daughters. He said that he was sure there had been some confusion about the estate proceedings, that Victoria had always been meticulous about legal matters, and that perhaps I'd misunderstood something about the inheritance process. The conversation revealed how completely Victoria had controlled the family narrative about Eleanor's estate,
Robert genuinely believed that I'd been properly notified about the inheritance and had chosen not to participate in the property sale. He'd been told that I'd been difficult to reach during the estate administration, that I'd seemed uninterested in dealing with legal complexities, and that the other heirs had proceeded without me only after extensive efforts to include me had failed. Robert's version of events was so different from reality that it took me several minutes to understand that he wasn't lying or deliberately covering for Victoria. He'd been systematically deceived just as thoroughly as I had, fed carefully crafted stories that painted me as irresponsible and disengaged, while positioning Victoria as the daughter who handled family obligations with appropriate seriousness and competence. When I told Robert about the evidence Jennifer had compiled, about the deliberately inadequate search efforts and the conflicts of interest in the property appraisal, his silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, he said that he would need to see the documentation himself before he could believe such serious accusations against his daughter, that family loyalty required giving Victoria the benefit of the doubt until proven otherwise. The second call came from Linda, who approached the situation with the emotional manipulation she'd perfected over decades of managing family conflict. She began by expressing hurt that I'd chosen to handle family matters through lawyers rather than coming to her first, suggesting that my decision to pursue legal action without warning showed a lack of respect for the family relationships that should take precedence over financial concern. Linda's strategy was to reframe the entire situation as a failure of communication rather than criminal behavior. She suggested that perhaps Victoria had made some mistakes in handling the estate administration, but that such errors were understandable given the stress and complexity of dealing with legal procedures while grieving Eleanor's death. She implied that my response was disproportionate to whatever problems might have occurred, that pursuing criminal charges against my own sister showed a vindictive streak that was unbecoming and destructive. When I tried to explain the scope of Victoria's deception, the deliberate nature of her fraud, and the ongoing profits she'd generated from stolen property, Linda responded with the kind of willful blindness that had enabled Victoria's behavior for years. She said that successful people sometimes had complicated business arrangements that might look questionable to outsiders, that Victoria's career achievements were the result of hard work and intelligence rather than anything improper. Linda's most revealing comment came when she suggested that I might be motivated by jealousy of Victoria's success rather than genuine concern about legal violation. She said that it was natural for siblings to feel competitive, but that allowing envy to destroy family relationships was a choice that would ultimately hurt me more than anyone else. The implication was clear: I was the problem, the source of dysfunction, the family member whose inability to accept Victoria's superiority was threatening everyone's peace and happiness. The third call came from Kevin, whose approach was more direct but equally dismissive of my concern. He started by saying that he'd spoken with Victoria and understood that there had been some confusion about the estate proceedings, but that pursuing legal action was an overreaction that would damage the family's reputation and create unnecessary financial burden for everyone involved. Kevin's version of events included details that I knew were false, suggesting that Victoria had tried multiple times to contact me about the inheritance, but had been unable to reach me due to my frequent moves and job changes. He claimed that the family had waited as long as possible before proceeding with the estate administration, but that eventually they'd had to move forward to avoid additional legal costs and complications. When I challenged Kevin's account with specific details about the fraudulent search efforts and the conflicts of interest in the property sale, he became defensive in a way that suggested he'd been coached by Victoria about how to respond to my accusation. He said that legal proceedings were complicated, and that people without law degrees shouldn't try to interpret documents they didn't understand, that I was probably misreading technical language and jumping to conclusions about innocent procedural matter. Kevin's most telling statement came when he said that even if there had been irregularities in the estate administration, pursuing criminal charges against Victoria would hurt the entire family without providing any real benefit to me. He suggested that a private settlement would be more appropriate, allowing Victoria to compensate me for any losses while avoiding the public embarrassment and legal costs that would result from a court case. The coordinated nature of these 3 phone calls was obvious, each family member delivering variations of the same message: I was overreacting to innocent mistakes, my motivations were suspect, and pursuing legal action would harm everyone without accomplishing anything positive. The strategy was clearly designed to isolate me from family support while pressuring me to accept a private resolution that would protect Victoria from criminal consequences. But the calls also revealed something that Victoria probably hadn't anticipated: the extent to which she'd had to lie to our parents and Kevin to maintain her version of events. The elaborate stories she'd told about trying to contact me about my supposed disinterest in inheritance matters, about the necessity of proceeding without my consent, all of these fabrications were now documented in Jennifer's case file as evidence of systematic deception. Victoria's need to manipulate our family members into defending her actually strengthened the criminal case against her, because it showed consciousness of guilt and ongoing efforts to obstruct justice. If her actions had been innocent mistakes, she wouldn't have needed to create false narratives to explain them or recruit family members to pressure me into dropping my legal claim. The fourth call came that evening, from Victoria herself, and it marked a dramatic shift in her approach from the careful manipulation she'd employed in previous communication. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger, and she dispensed with any pretense of sisterly concern or family reconciliation. She said that she'd received my legal papers and wanted to make it clear that I was making the biggest mistake of my life by pursuing such ridiculous accusations. Victoria's opening gambit was to deny everything, claiming that the estate administration had been handled properly and that my allegations were based on misunderstandings and misinterpretations of routine legal procedure. She said that inheritance matters were complex and that I'd obviously fallen under the influence of lawyers who were more interested in generating fees than uncovering truth. But as the conversation continued, Victoria's denials became less convincing and her anger more apparent. She accused me of being ungrateful for everything the family had done for me over the years, of biting the hand that had fed me, of destroying relationships that could never be repaired for the sake of money that I didn't deserve and wouldn't know how to manage responsibly. The mask of sisterly concern that Victoria had worn for years finally slipped completely, revealing the contempt and resentment that had always motivated her behavior toward me. She said that I'd always been the weak link in the family, the one who couldn't handle responsibility or make good decisions, the daughter who embarrassed our parents with my lack of ambition and achievement. Victoria's most revealing statement came when she said that Eleanor had probably intended the inheritance for people who would use it wisely, not for someone who would waste it on frivolous expenses and poor financial choices. She argued that by ensuring the property was sold to responsible investors rather than left in my incompetent hands, she'd actually been honoring our grandmother's true intentions better than the literal terms of the will would have done. The rationalization was breathtaking in its arrogance and self-serving logic. Victoria had convinced herself that stealing my inheritance was actually a form of protection, that depriving me of financial security was somehow in my best interests, that her judgment about what I deserved was more valid than Eleanor's explicit wishes expressed in a legal document. When I pointed out that her actions were crimes regardless of her personal opinions about my worthiness, Victoria's response revealed the depth of her narcissism and entitlement. She said that successful people sometimes had to make difficult decisions that others couldn't understand, that I was too small-minded to appreciate the complexities of business and finance, that my accusations were the product of jealousy and ignorance rather than legitimate grievances. Victoria's final attempt at manipulation was to threaten consequences if I proceeded with the legal case. She said that pursuing criminal charges would destroy any possibility of future family relationships, that our parents would never forgive me for putting their daughter in legal jeopardy, that Kevin would cut off all contact rather than associate with someone who attacked family members through the court. She also hinted at financial retaliation, suggesting that the legal costs of defending herself would be substantial and that she would seek to recover those expenses from me if my case was unsuccessful. The threat was clearly designed to intimidate me into backing down, to make me fear that pursuing justice might leave me in worse financial condition than accepting the theft. But Victoria's threats actually had the opposite effect from what she intended. Her angry denials and desperate attempts at intimidation confirmed that Jennifer's case was solid, that the evidence was strong enough to genuinely threaten Victoria's freedom and reputation. If the accusations had been baseless, Victoria would have responded with confidence and facts rather than anger and manipulation. After hanging up from Victoria's call, I sat in my apartment, feeling a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in my adult life, I'd had a conversation with my sister, where I wasn't trying to maintain peace, or avoid conflict or accommodate her need for control. I'd simply stated facts and defended my right to seek justice, refusing to be manipulated into accepting her version of reality. The contrast between Victoria's frantic defensiveness and my own calm certainty was striking. She was scrambling to maintain lies that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, while I was standing on solid ground, supported by documentation and evidence. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for decades had completely reversed, with Victoria now dependent on my willingness to accept her manipulation, rather than me being dependent on her approval. The next morning brought news that crystallized the magnitude of what I'd set in motion. Jennifer called to inform me that Patterson and Associates had suspended Victoria pending an internal investigation into her role in the Pinwood Apartments transaction.
The company's lawyers had apparently reviewed the evidence in my case file and concluded that Victoria's actions posed significant liability risks that required immediate damage control measures. Jennifer explained that Patterson and Associates was now trying to distance themselves from Victoria's conduct, claiming that she had acted without proper authorization and that the company had been unaware of the conflicts of interest and legal irregularities involved in the property purchase. They were cooperating fully with law enforcement and had indicated willingness to settle my civil claims in exchange for agreement not to pursue charges against the company itself. The professional consequences for Victoria were immediate and severe. Her suspension from Patterson and Associates was unpaid, effectively cutting off her primary source of income while legal proceedings were pending. Her access to company resources and business contacts was terminated, eliminating the professional networks that had enabled her fraudulent schemes. Her reputation in the local business community was already suffering as word of the criminal investigation spread through industry circles. But Jennifer had even more significant news to share. The district attorney's office had reviewed the evidence and decided to file formal criminal charges against Victoria for estate fraud, property theft, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The federal authorities were also investigating potential violations of banking and investment regulations related to the fraudulent property transaction. The criminal charges carried potential penalties that could include substantial prison time, not just financial restitution. Victoria was facing the possibility of felony convictions that would permanently destroy her career prospects and result in the loss of her professional licenses and certification. The consequences she'd threatened me with for pursuing the case were now falling on her own head in far more severe form than anything I could have faced. Jennifer also informed me that Michael, the cousin who'd been manipulated into participating in the fraudulent property sale, had contacted her office after learning about the criminal investigation. He was cooperating fully with law enforcement and had provided additional evidence about how Victoria had misrepresented the estate administration process to secure his consent to the sale. Michael's testimony revealed that Victoria had told him I'd been contacted about the inheritance, but had expressed no interest in participating in property management or real estate investment. She'd convinced him that selling quickly was in everyone's best interests, because I was financially irresponsible and would likely want to cash out my share immediately anyway. His cooperation meant that Victoria could no longer claim that the other heirs had been innocent victims of administrative confusion. The criminal investigation had also uncovered evidence of additional fraudulent activities in Victoria's professional work. Investigations examining her business communications had found records of other transactions where she'd failed to disclose conflicts of interest or had misrepresented material facts to clients and colleagues. The Pinwood Apartments case was apparently just one example of a broader pattern of unethical and illegal behavior. As the legal machinery ground forward with gathering momentum, I found myself experiencing emotions I hadn't expected. Rather than satisfaction at Victoria's downfall, I felt a profound sadness at the waste of human potential and the destruction of family relationships that her choices had made inevitable. She'd had intelligence, education, professional opportunities, and family support, but she'd chosen to use those advantages to exploit and manipulate rather than to build something positive. The tragedy wasn't just what Victoria had done to me, but what she'd done to herself. She'd constructed her entire adult identity around an image of success and competence that was built on a foundation of lies and theft. When that foundation crumbled, as it inevitably would, everything she'd tried to build on top of it would collapse as well. I also felt grief for the family relationships that couldn't be salvaged from the wreckage of Victoria's deceptions. Robert, Linda, and Kevin had been manipulated just as thoroughly as I had, fed carefully crafted lies that had shaped their understanding of family dynamics for years. Learning the truth about Victoria's behavior would force them to question their own judgment and confront their complicity in enabling her abuse. But alongside the sadness, I felt something else. A deep sense of peace that came from finally living in alignment with my own values rather than accommodating other people's dysfunction. For years, I'd accepted treatment that violated my fundamental beliefs about how people should treat each other, convinced myself that family loyalty required tolerating abuse, and sacrificed my own well-being to maintain relationships that were ultimately toxic. The legal case had forced me to choose between maintaining comfortable illusions and demanding accountability for harmful behavior. Choosing accountability had been painful and isolating, but it had also been liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was no longer carrying the emotional burden of pretending that unacceptable treatment was somehow normal or loving. Marcus called that afternoon to provide an update on the property management situation. Cedar Ridge Investments had contacted Pacific Northwest Property Solutions to terminate their management contract, apparently hoping to distance themselves from the building before the criminal investigation could implicate them in Victoria's fraudulent scheme. Marcus's company was now working directly with the court-appointed estate administrator to manage the property while ownership issues were resolved. The immediate effect was that all plans for rent increases and tenant displacement had been suspended indefinitely. The conversion to luxury condominiums couldn't proceed while the property ownership was in legal dispute, which meant that Mrs. Thompson and the other long-term residents were safe from eviction for the foreseeable future. Eleanor's intention that the building continue providing affordable housing was being honored, at least temporarily, through the very legal action that was exposing Victoria's betrayal of that intention. Marcus also shared some personal news that surprised me with its timing and significance. He said that working on my case had reminded him why he'd chosen property management as a career, that he'd originally been drawn to the field because of its potential to create stable communities rather than just maximize profit. He'd decided to start his own property management company focused specifically on preserving affordable housing and supporting tenant community. He asked if I would consider partnering with him in this new venture, bringing my inherited stake in Pinwood Apartments as the foundation for a business model that prioritized community service over profit maximization. The proposal was unexpected but appealing, offering a way to honor Eleanor's intentions while creating positive change in the local housing market. The conversation with Marcus crystallized something important about the difference between relationships built on mutual respect and those based on power and control. Despite knowing each other for less than a year, and despite our relationship being initially transactional, Marcus had consistently treated me with dignity and consideration. He'd shared important information because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. He'd offered partnership because he believed in my character and capabilities, not because he wanted to control or manipulate me. The contrast with my family relationships was stark and illuminating. Victoria, who'd known me my entire life and claimed to love me, had stolen from me without hesitation. Robert and Linda, who'd raised me and should have protected me, had enabled Victoria's abuse through willful blindness and misplaced loyalty. Kevin, who'd shared my childhood and should have understood our family dynamics, had dismissed my concerns without investigation or empathy. But Marcus, who owed me nothing beyond basic professional courtesy, had chosen to act with integrity and kindness when he could have easily looked the other way. His willingness to expose Victoria's crimes had been motivated by simple human decency rather than family obligation or legal requirement. As January progressed toward February, the criminal case against Victoria moved forward with the methodical thoroughness of the justice system. Grand jury indictments were handed down, arraignments were scheduled, and plea negotiations began between Victoria's defense attorneys and the prosecutor. Each development was reported in the local newspaper, transforming our family's private dysfunction into public knowledge and community discussion. The media attention was difficult for everyone involved, but it also served an important purpose by educating the community about estate fraud and the vulnerability of inheritance beneficiaries to manipulation by family members. Several other people contacted Jennifer's office after reading about my case, reporting similar experiences of being excluded from inheritance proceedings or pressured into property sales that seemed questionable in retrospect. Victoria's criminal behavior had apparently been part of a broader pattern of estate fraud that affected multiple families in the region. Her prosecution would likely lead to investigations of other suspicious transactions and potentially prevent future victims from being exploited by similar schemes. The community impact extended beyond the immediate legal consequence. Local lawyers began offering educational seminars about estate planning and inheritance rights, helping families understand how to protect themselves from the kind of manipulation that Victoria had employed. Real estate professionals implemented new disclosure requirements for transactions involving family-owned properties, creating safeguards against conflicts of interest and fraudulent sale. My decision to pursue justice rather than accept private settlement had created positive changes that reached far beyond my individual case. Eleanor's gift of property had become a catalyst for community education and legal reform, honoring her memory in ways that went beyond simple financial restitution. As winter began its slow transition toward spring, I found myself looking forward rather than backward for the first time in years. The legal case would continue for months, possibly years, but the fundamental questions had been answered. Victoria's crimes had been exposed, justice was being pursued, and the community was safer from similar exploitation in the future. I was no longer the confused and diminished person who'd sat on a porch eating Christmas dinner from a paper plate, accepting humiliation because I'd been taught that family loyalty required such sacrifice. I was someone who'd chosen truth over comfort, justice over convenience, community over personal advantage. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless, but it had been necessary and ultimately healing. I'd learned that real love didn't require accepting abuse, that genuine family relationships were built on mutual respect rather than hierarchical control, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was to stop enabling harmful behavior by holding people accountable for their choices. Eleanor's inheritance had given me more than property or financial security. It had given me the opportunity to discover my own strength, to stand up for my own worth, and to protect others from the kind of exploitation I'd experienced. The gift she'd intended to provide comfort and stability had instead provided something more valuable: the chance to live with dignity and integrity, regardless of the cost. The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning, nearly 10 months after Marcus's phone call had first revealed the scope of Victoria's deception. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wooden benches that reminded me uncomfortably of church pews and tall windows that let in autumn sunlight that seemed too cheerful for such a solemn occasion. Victoria sat at the defendant's table wearing a navy suit that looked expensive but somehow diminished on her frame, her shoulders curved inward in a way that made her appear smaller than I remember. Judge Patricia Reeves had a reputation for fairness tempered with firmness, and her handling of Victoria's case had demonstrated both qualities throughout the lengthy legal proceeding. She'd rejected 2 separate plea bargain attempts that would have allowed Victoria to avoid prison time, stating that the systematic nature of her fraud and the betrayal of family trust warranted consequences that reflected the seriousness of her crime. The prosecution had presented a devastating case that went far beyond my stolen inheritance. Investigators had uncovered evidence of similar fraudulent schemes involving at least 6 other families, with Victoria using her position at Patterson and Associates to identify vulnerable estates and manipulate probate proceedings for personal gain. The total value of her thefts exceeded $800,000, money she'd used to fund her lifestyle and advance her career while leaving victims struggling with financial hardships they didn't understand. Jennifer Walsh had done extraordinary work building the case, but the moment that had most powerfully conveyed the human cost of Victoria's crimes had come during the victim impact statements. Mrs. Elizabeth Cartwright, an elderly woman whose late husband's property had been fraudulently sold through one of Victoria's schemes, had testified about losing the family farm that had been in her husband's family for 4 generations. Her voice had broken as she described having to move into a small apartment, after believing for months that the sale had been legitimate. Michael had also testified, explaining how Victoria's manipulation had made him unwittingly complicit in defrauding his own cousin. His statement had been particularly effective because it demonstrated how Victoria's crimes had damaged relationships and caused guilt and confusion among people who'd trusted her professional expertise. He'd spoken about the shame of learning that his signature on legal documents had helped steal from someone he cared about. When my turn came to address the court, I'd found myself speaking not just about the financial impact of Victoria's theft, but about the psychological damage caused by years of systematic manipulation, designed to make me doubt my own worth and judgment. I'd explained how Victoria's abuse had been enabled by a family dynamic that prioritized maintaining appearances over protecting vulnerable members, and how her crimes had forced me to confront the difference between genuine love and conditional acceptance. I'd also spoken about the positive changes that had emerged from pursuing justice rather than accepting private settlement, the community education programs about estate fraud, the legal reforms that would protect future inheritance beneficiaries, the preservation of affordable housing at Pinwood Apartments. All of these outcomes had resulted from choosing accountability over family loyalty. Victoria's defense attorney had argued for leniency based on her lack of prior criminal record and the professional and personal consequences she'd already suffered. He'd presented character witnesses who described her volunteer work with local charities and her reputation as a dedicated employee, painting a picture of someone who'd made serious mistakes rather than someone who was fundamentally criminal in character. But the evidence of premeditation and systematic deception had been too overwhelming for such arguments to carry much weight. Victoria's crimes hadn't been momentary lapses in judgment. They'd been carefully planned schemes that required months of preparation and ongoing maintenance of elaborate lies. The betrayal of family trust made her actions particularly egregious in the court's assessment. Judge Reeves had taken 30 minutes to deliver her sentencing decision, methodically reviewing the factors that had influenced her judgment. She'd noted the sophistication of Victoria's schemes, the vulnerability of her victims, and the breach of professional ethics that had enabled her crimes. She'd also acknowledged the full cooperation Victoria had eventually provided in identifying other victims and recovering stolen assets. The sentence was 3 years and 8 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation during which Victoria would be prohibited from working in any capacity involving estate administration or real estate transactions. She would also be required to pay full restitution to all identified victims, a sum that would likely consume any remaining assets she possessed, and saddle her with debt that would take decades to resolve. As the bailiff had led Victoria away after sentencing, she'd turned to look at our family section of the courtroom one final time. Robert and Linda had attended every hearing, sitting in quiet dignity that couldn't entirely mask their devastation at seeing their daughter's life destroyed by her own choices. Their presence had been a form of support for Victoria, but also an acknowledgement that accountability was necessary even when it caused tremendous pain. Kevin had attended less frequently, struggling with anger at Victoria for deceiving him and guilt about his role in pressuring me to drop the case. His journey toward understanding the full scope of what had happened had been particularly difficult because it required acknowledging how completely he'd been manipulated into becoming an unwitting ally in Victoria's campaign against. Victoria's final glance hadn't been directed at our parents or Kevin, it had been focused on me, and for just a moment, her expression had held something that might have been recognition rather than resentment. Perhaps she'd finally understood that my pursuit of justice hadn't been motivated by revenge or greed, but by a refusal to accept that family relationships should be built on lies and exploitation. The months since Victoria's imprisonment had brought a different kind of healing than I'd expected. Rather than satisfaction at her downfall,
I'd felt a profound sadness at the waste of human potential and the unnecessary destruction of family bonds. Victoria's intelligence and energy could have been channeled into building something positive, creating value rather than destroying it, strengthening relationships rather than exploiting them. But alongside the sadness had come a deeper understanding of the difference between genuine reconciliation and superficial peacemaking. True healing couldn't happen until the underlying problems were acknowledged and addressed. Victoria's crimes had been symptoms of character flaws that would have continued causing harm until they were confronted through consequences serious enough to force real change. The partnership with Marcus had evolved into something more meaningful than either of us had initially anticipated. Pacific Community Properties, the company we'd founded together, now managed 12 affordable housing properties throughout the region, with a business model that proved community-focused property management could be both ethical and profitable. Our approach prioritized long-term tenant stability over short-term profit maximization, investing in building maintenance and community programs that created environments where people could build stable lives rather than just temporary shelter. The model had attracted attention from housing advocates and social investors who were looking for alternatives to the purely profit-driven approach that dominated the real estate industry. Eleanor's inheritance had become the foundation for something larger than individual financial security. The 25% stake in Pinwood Apartments that Victoria had tried to steal had grown into a portfolio of properties that provided affordable housing for hundreds of families while generating sustainable returns for investors who shared our values. Miss Thompson had become something of an unofficial grandmother figure in my life, her gentle wisdom and practical perspective providing guidance as I navigated the challenges of business ownership and community leadership. Her morning walks with Buster had become a daily reminder that simple pleasures and consistent routines could provide more satisfaction than grand achievements or complex schemes. The relationship with Marcus had also evolved beyond professional partnership into something personal and meaningful. His steady character and genuine kindness had provided a stark contrast to the conditional love and manipulation that had characterized my family relationship. Learning to trust someone whose actions consistently matched their words had been a gradual process, but one that had taught me what healthy relationships could feel like. We'd married in a small ceremony at Riverside Park the previous spring, surrounded by friends from the tenant community and colleagues from the affordable housing advocacy world. The guest list had been carefully curated to include people who demonstrated genuine care for our well-being rather than those who felt entitled to inclusion based on family connections or social obligation. Robert and Linda had been invited and had attended, their presence reflecting the slow progress we'd made toward rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than hierarchical obligation. The process had been difficult for all of us, requiring honest conversations about enabling behavior and family dynamics that had protected Victoria while harming me. Kevin had chosen not to attend, still struggling with guilt and anger about his role in the family dysfunction that had enabled Victoria's crimes. His journey toward understanding and healing was proceeding at his own pace, and I'd learned to respect his need for space rather than trying to force reconciliation according to my timeline. Victoria herself had written me a letter from prison several months after her sentencing, the first direct communication between us since the angry phone call when she'd received the legal papers. The letter had been surprisingly introspective, acknowledging the harm she'd caused and expressing what seemed like genuine remorse for her actions. She'd written about the therapy she was receiving in prison, work that was helping her understand the thought patterns and entitlement that had enabled her criminal behavior. She'd described recognizing how her need to feel superior to others had led her to rationalize increasingly harmful actions, convincing herself that her victims somehow deserved their suffering. The letter had included an apology that felt more genuine than anything Victoria had ever said to me in person. She'd acknowledged that her treatment of me had been cruel and unjustified, that her theft of my inheritance had been motivated by greed rather than any concern for my well-being, and that her manipulation of family relationships had been designed to protect herself rather than help anyone else. Victoria had also written about her hopes for the future, her plans to use her remaining prison time to develop skills that would allow her to contribute positively to society after her release. She'd expressed interest in working with organizations that helped white-collar offenders reintegrate into legitimate careers, using her experience to help others avoid the choices that had destroyed her own life. I'd responded to Victoria's letter with cautious optimism, acknowledging her apology while making it clear that rebuilding any relationship between us would require sustained demonstration of changed behavior over time. Trust, once broken so completely, couldn't be restored through words alone, but her willingness to engage in genuine self-reflection suggested that healing might eventually be possible. The legal settlement had ultimately recovered not just my stolen inheritance, but additional damages that reflected the investment returns I would have earned over the years. Victoria had denied me access to the property. The total amount had provided financial security beyond anything I'd previously imagined, but more importantly, it had validated Eleanor's intention to provide for my future well-being. I'd used a portion of the settlement to establish the Eleanor Brooks Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to inheritance fraud victims and educational resources about estate planning and beneficiary rights. The foundation's work had already helped dozens of families navigate complex legal situations and recover assets that had been fraudulently taken from them. The foundation had also funded research into the psychological dynamics that enabled financial abuse between family members, contributing to a growing body of knowledge about how trust and emotional manipulation could be weaponized for economic exploitation. Understanding these patterns was crucial for developing prevention strategies and helping victims recognize abuse before it caused irreparable harm. As I sat in my office at Pacific Community Properties on a December afternoon almost 2 years after that transformative Christmas Eve, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected directions my life had taken. The woman who'd been exiled from her family's dinner table had become a business owner, community leader and advocate for social justice causes that had grown directly from her personal experience of injustice. The pain of family betrayal had been transformed into purposeful action that was helping other people avoid similar exploitation.
Eleanor's gift had multiplied far beyond its original value, creating positive change that rippled through the community in ways that honored her memory and validated her faith in my potential. The Christmas season approaching felt different than any I'd experienced before. Instead of anxiety about family gatherings and the performance of gratitude for conditional acceptance, I felt anticipation for celebrations with people who valued my authentic self rather than demanding that I conform to their expectations. Marcus and I were hosting Christmas dinner for the first time, inviting Mrs. Thompson and several other Pinwood residents along with colleagues from the affordable housing community. The guest list represented chosen family rather than biological obligation, people who'd earned their place at our table through kindness and mutual respect rather than genetic accident. The menu was simple but meaningful, featuring dishes that reflected our guests' cultural backgrounds and personal preferences, rather than rigid traditions that prioritized appearance over enjoyment. The conversation would likely focus on shared interests and genuine connection rather than competitive status updates and subtle put-downs disguised as concern. Looking back on the journey that had brought me to this point, I could see how Victoria's cruelty had inadvertently become a gift by forcing me to choose between accepting abuse and demanding better treatment. Her theft of my inheritance had led to its recovery with interest. Her manipulation of family relationships had taught me to recognize healthy boundaries, and her crimes had inspired work that was helping other people seek justice for similar violations. The Christmas Eve when I'd been forced to eat dinner outside had marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. Walking away from that humiliation had been the first step toward discovering my own worth, developing genuine relationships, and building a life aligned with my values rather than other people's expectations. Eleanor's inheritance had provided more than financial security. It had provided the opportunity to learn that love didn't require sacrifice of dignity, that family bonds should strengthen rather than diminish the people within them, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable harmful behavior by demanding atonement for actions that caused real harm. As snow began falling outside my office window, I felt gratitude for the painful lessons that had led to profound growth, for the stolen inheritance that had become recovered justice, and for the family relationships that had been lost and the community connections that had been gained. The Christmas season would bring celebration of transformation rather than endurance of dysfunction, joy rooted in authentic relationships rather than performance of artificial harmony. Victoria was serving her sentence and working toward genuine rehabilitation. Our parents were learning to build relationships based on respect rather than control, and I was living a life that honored Eleanor's faith in my potential while creating positive change that extended far beyond personal benefit. The gift my grandmother had tried to give me had ultimately become a gift to the entire community, transforming pain into purpose and betrayal into justice. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that were limited only by imagination and commitment, rather than family dynamics and inherited dysfunction. I'd learned to build my own table rather than fighting for a seat at one where my presence was merely tolerated, and that table was large enough to welcome anyone who approached with genuine kindness and mutual respect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.